With the announcement of season 2, I figured it'd be kind of fun to jump back into the class tier list, talk about the best class going into season 2. I know it's a long time away, but well, gotta get the word out there for the classes that feel a little weaker, because I hope to see some changes going forward for some of the lower rated classes on this list. Now, normally I kind of do a split list, but today I'm actually just going to do an overall class tier list. Now, the vast majority of gameplay in this game is going to be from level 45 to level 100, right? That is, well, going to be a very similar gameplay loop. Nightmare dungeons, building out your build, and then eventually just completely having your entire build. And oftentimes you can run the same build as soon as you get into World Tier 3, which starts roughly around level 45. Now, not always are going to have your build online, and that's totally fine, but for the purposes of this video, well, we're considering mostly that. Some of the leveling builds can sometimes be different, and sometimes the end game builds can have slight differences, but for the most part, the strength of the class relies in that 45 to 100 process. That is what people are shooting for, and that is what people want, okay? And we got to start it off with, overall, I'm going to put the Druid at top, right? Absolute S tier class. This class is just so insanely good at so many things. The only problem that this class has ever really had was that very, very early game. And I would wager to say that their very, very early game isn't as bad as it used to be. It's far better than what we had experienced in the past. And so, thinking about that, and then also considering the fact that they have one of the fastest speed clearing builds, they have some of the strongest nightmare dungeon pushing builds, they just have some of the strongest everything in the game, coupled with such insanely powerful damage reduction effects, makes them extremely survivable, extremely fast, and extremely high damage with things like, well, the shred options. You have pulverize, still really, really good. Werewolf tornado, a very popular fan favorite. That one just does insane single target damage with those homing tornadoes. And then, of course, you have the really amazing speed clear lightning storm druid, which I personally find to be my favorite option. Just the most fun for me. But that's going to be an S tier, okay? S tier class, no doubt about it. And as we move into our second class here, I feel like we're really not going to have any class below the B tier, okay? So as we jump into the second class, it's got to be the rogue, okay? The rogue just decimates everything in that process of the game where you're getting your build online and you are farming basically for the remainder of the game. It just dominates. And as you jump into the later nightmare dungeon pushing, well, guess what? It's still quite good. Because you have so many options to permanently CC through your shared misery aspects and all sorts of builds like twisting blades, even trappers, or even running things like rapid fire or any other option, flurry. You could even do barrage. I've seen all of it just synergizes so well. The thing with the rogue is that they have the most, I guess you'd say, strong support for all of their abilities, that there isn't really a build that would be put, in my opinion, below A tier. I think every single build that the rogue has is A tier or above in terms of the grand scheme of the game. So in terms of overall viability for versatility, well, rogue is top tier. There's no one even close. But their maximum potential, I think, gets outshined by just a tad from the druid. And that's mainly to do as you get deeper and deeper into the game. Because one thing's for sure is that the rogue gets online way, way faster. And with the barber being active, you have so many more additional options to speed clear, and you don't even have to really push twisting blades, although that is really applicable to every class at the current moment. Jumping into the A tiers here, I'm gonna have to put the Necro, well, we're jumping around here. Necromancer, still exceptionally good. Bone Spear is still one of the top tier builds, and if you were just to talk about Bone Spear, well, you can have an argument for S tier. But considering the fact that Bone Spear isn't the only option that people run, and they have some pretty dog water trash builds, and many of their builds are kind of like that mediocre to decent level, the one real big shiner is Bone Spear. But then you also have like the Infinite Mist builds. I've seen some Blood Surge options doing quite nice. And these options are solid. I would put them above like that decent category where you have like Sever Necromancer, like Blood Lance is just okay, and then as you get really really below a lot of options, you have like the Bone Spirit, which has just gotten heavily nerfed. I mean, you have so many builds that are just kind of mediocre, but one thing's for sure is that the Necromancer pumps out damage. They'll never be as fast as the Druid or Rogue at clearing, but they have potential to shoot up higher due to their damage and their long range, with Bone Spear specifically. But you also have a really unique survivability aspect with like the Infinimus builds, so you have some options to go for. Overall, I think that puts them solidly in the A category. But you got some options with the Necromancer. Not as many as the Druid and Rogue, but still decent. But then we jump into the last two classes. I want to put the Barbarian over the Sorcerer. I do think the Barbarian's a little bit better than the Sorcerer. I know some people are going to debate me on this, but Barbarian just really, really has amazing time clearing once you get the builds really rolling. And Double Swing has been particularly climbing on my list. I wasn't a huge fan of Double Swing, but there's been a lot of things that you could do with Double Swing to make me very impressed. One thing that's really changed it is the Barber. Using it with the Barbarian, the Barber with the Barbarian, and Double Swing turns Double Swing into a very strong clearing option, which has been really, really impressive in my opinion. Whirlwind's still good. Whirlwind was the strongest build. They nerfed it incredibly hard. Like every single patch that came out for the majority of the first few weeks of the game was nerf to Barbarian, nerf to Barbarian, nerf to Barbarian. And there's a reason for that, because it was the strongest build in the game. But it's still strong. That's how strong it was. Okay, so you have a couple of other options like Hoda Barb or Walking Arsenal's not bad. But the problem with those is they don't compete with a lot of the top tier builds, and they're not even as good as the Whirlwind or Double Swing. And so like there's a big drop off between like Double Swing and Whirlwind builds, and even like Hoda, which I felt was pretty strong in the previous season as well. Well, a lot of those builds are just okay or decent, and then you start to talk about like Upheaval and other options that people are coming up with, and they're just trash. Like, I mean, it is just so garbage compared to the other options, and that's kind of unfortunate. I think that with Barbarian, since it is our first B tier class and going to be tied to the lowest rating on Sorcerer, because we're going to drop Sorcerer in here, I think what these two classes really need, in my opinion, is more options to kind of buff up their core mechanics rather than a specific skill. Okay, what they've done with the Barbarian and the Sorcerer specifically is nerf a lot of their play patterns and nerf a lot of their core synergy aspects and things like that, or passives. And that's part of the reason why Sorcerer is the last on this list, and we should talk about Sorcerer a little bit because they have some solid options. Like Ice Shards is still good, Blizzard Sorcerer is still good, Chain Lightning did get a buff, right? Fireball did get a buff as well, but unfortunately a lot of those builds are just not that great in the grand scheme of the game. Again, if you just consider like, can I clear with this? Can I clear decently fast? Yeah, it's decent builds. That's why it's in the B tier. When you start to consider like Bone Spear, or you start to consider things like Pulverize or Twisting Blades or so many other options with the Rogue or Druid, you just don't see the Sorcerer pumping out that kind of damage, and you don't have the backing up of survivability from the Druid, for example. So unfortunately, the Sorcerer kind of just left by the wayside. And again, I think the really big problem with this is that Blizzard decided that the best way to nerf classes is to nerf all builds and then buff the specific ones that are not up to par. For example, when they had Sorcerer or Necromancer, what they decided to do is nerf the bone passives, and they decided to nerf a lot of the fire, synergies and a lot of the crit damage from honestly both of these classes, right? And the problem with that is like, yeah, Bone Spear and Ice Shards were taking the best use out of that and applying it and getting a solid build out of it. But there's also a reason why those builds were good, and that's because they're using some of the best passives. When you nerf them, it affects every build. And then they decide to buff them individually. Like, okay, we're going to buff Chain Lightning aspects, and then we're going to buff Fireball aspects. Problem with that is that, guess what? Now Fireball and Chain Lightning are only slightly worse than Ice Shards. but Ice Shards is still worse than it was before. And guess what? Ice Shards wasn't even a top tier S tier build, in my opinion, in season 1 compared to a lot of their classes. So it's like Sorcerer and Barbarian have this same problem where one build seems to overshine way higher than the other options on that specific class. Not in the grand scheme of the game necessarily, although Barbarian in that specific case, it was at the very beginning of the game. And then they take that and they're like, oh, this class is broken. So they nerf the whole class and then they buff up the trash builds. And it's like, wait, no. The class wasn't broken. Those builds were just overperforming and these builds were underperforming. You need to buff up the ladder and not nerf the whole class. Don't do that. Please don't just nerf the whole class by nerfing a lot of the passives. For some classes like the Rogue needed that Siphoning Strikes nerf. I think that was a pretty fair, even though it completely gutted that passive and it's basically unusable at this point. Well, I think that was a reasonable nerf. And, same thing with the Druid. A lot of overall things that you might have used in multiple builds. I think these are reasonable nerfs. When you have a class as strong as the Rogue or as strong as the Druid, they need these overall nerfs. But you can't apply that same philosophy towards classes that are a little bit weaker. And of course, I wouldn't be, proper in rating my Sorcerer rating without talking about some of the absolute dog water builds. Now, at the very bottom, we have things like Companion Druid, to be fair. Okay, Druid is responsible of one of the worst builds in the game, but also we have Incinerate Sorcerer, which is just not even a build. Like, people won't even put it on their lists anymore because it's just a meme at this point. But then you also have things like Firewall's pretty mediocre, Meteor's pretty mediocre, Arclash, when you get into that farming stage, is pretty mediocre. I mean, they have by far the biggest amount of builds that people are coming up with, and yet they have the biggest amount of garbage that people are coming up with. Not because, people are coming up with bad builds, but because the Sorcerer doesn't really have much to work with. It is so tragic. But one thing that I will say is that, in my opinion, the class balance has never been something like, oh yeah, their classes are like down here when you consider the overall viability of these classes. There's just been clear favorites and clear losers in each of the different patches that we've had so far. And one of the biggest losers still is, even with the very recent patches that we've all gotten, is the Sorcerer and Barbarian. Going into Season 2, as I mentioned, well, I wanted to talk about this because I wanted to see kind of what these classes really needed, What do they need going into Season 2? What changed in Season 1 that made the classes kind of shift their rankings? Because if you had asked me day 1 of Diablo 4 release, the class rankings would look something like, this, where all classes are pretty strong, maybe even Necromancer in the B tier, but there was a lot of S tier classes, and you could even argue that Necromancer, once we got the hang of things, was actually a A tier. The only problem is that it was slow, right? And in Season 1, one of the big things that we ended up getting was that fact that we got the hearts, right? That was the main change. The hearts really favor a specific classes. The Necromancer, for example, has really powerful hearts. The Rogue does as well. And I mean, every class has access to the Barber, so that just changes the dynamic a lot as well. But I think going into Season 2, one thing that we really want to see is just options to buff up like the overall strength in terms of the core passives for both these classes I mentioned earlier. And hopefully we're going to get actual options to see for the unique powers in each season for each class. Necromancer's over here playing, autopilot on their builds with auto corpse tendrils. Meanwhile, these other classes are like getting something mediocre that doesn't really do anything. And in fact, you just want to run the standard generalized hearts, which doesn't seem very exciting for one, but also good for the class. But let me know what you all think in the comment section down below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all for the next one.